every year we get to the spring, there's a lot of guys that weren't on these circuit events. It's our job as scouts to identify players wherever they are. It doesn't matter if you're playing rec league. If there's talent, we will find you.
Okay, guys, today's guest brings a wealth of knowledge and experience as not only a previous professional baseball player himself for the Kansas City Royals, but he's currently the West Coast cross-checker for the Detroit Tigers. Today, my guest is Alex McClure, and he and I dive deep into the world of scouting. If you're a parent or a player and you're wondering what scouts are looking for in a player, this is your episode. Alex tells us how this part of the business actually works and the best things to focus on to attract the attention and opportunities that every player ultimately is looking for. Alex explains the different levels of scouting throughout organizations, how they differ, and why parents actually should never focus on the exposure over the development. Alex shares at what age players begin being scouted, and he also tells us what scouts typically look for in both pitchers and position players. He even goes in depth about the process at the field when he scouts a player. Alex informs us about the physical attributes that scouts find valuable and why playing multiple sports, wait for it, could actually be a good thing. Let's dive into this conversation with Alex McClure. I hope you enjoy. Alex McClure, thanks for being here, buddy.
Yeah, man, of course. Always for Hannaford.
I love that. So look, obviously, anybody who's listening to this, maybe they have a son who plays travel baseball or youth baseball. But I think what's important is give people some context about you personally, like how you came to this place. Because the funny thing for me is, whether it's in my position as an agent or your position as a scout, nobody grows up saying, I want to be an agent for Major League Baseball players at 5 years old. No one grows up and says, I want to be a scout for a Major League team at 5 years old. We both probably shared the same dream, which was we want to be professional baseball players, right? And both of us kind of, unfortunately, I have to admit, we're failed baseball players, but we both found a way to stay in the game. So walk me through, what was your story? How did you get to the point where you became a scout? Like, what happened before that point?
Yeah, of course. I wish I had the upside to still be playing, but here we are on this side of things, and glad to be a part of it, honestly. But yeah, I grew up in baseball. My dad was a college coach for a long time, so was around it on the field. Obviously, being around it, you just, as baseball people say, it kind of becomes part of your life, right? It's your being, it's who you become, and you're at the field a lot, and it's just what it is. And so I transitioned, obviously played all through high school, played in college, and then was able to be drafted by Kansas City Royals in 2010, and then was traded to Miami. So I got the chance to play professionally, and then I even coached in college for a couple years, and then got a job with the Chicago Cubs as a scout. So that was a little fast for my background, but basically grew up in the game my whole life, and then progressed as a player. Realized, this isn't probably going to work out as a player, and wanted to stay in the game. And, like-minded like yourself, like passionate about the player, the person, that part of baseball, inspired me to want to be around the game more. And then, which led me into getting back into professional baseball. And here I am, in my 8th year now, and now working for the Tigers, in the amateur scouting space.
Did you ever really think that coaching was the pathway rather than scouting first? I mean, obviously I know you were a coach, but at what point when you made that transition to a scout from a coach, like what was the thought there?
Yeah, for sure. I think that was like kind of all I knew, too. And so that was an easy transition for me, was like, all right, how's the best way to be around baseball and to be around players? Okay, I can get on the field. I'm good at that. I know I can hit fungos. I can throw BP. I can do all those things. And then, honestly, I didn't think about scouting. It was approached to me, and it was at the time, as you know, like when you're in your early days of trying to find your career, you're trying to make some money, and I was married at the time, and scouting at the time provided me, not only was it a great opportunity with a great club, but it provided me benefits and better monetary value at the time. And that wasn't the only reason, but I could tell there was like a sense of culture and this like passion when I talked to people about about scouting and what it looked like and identifying players and, getting into the homes of players and that connection side, you create this personal connection with these players and just, I love the people part of it. And for the sound of it, it sounded like something that really fired me up. And so that was an easy transition for me because it hit on a lot of things that I prioritize.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this earlier. Obviously, as you played college baseball, I've known you for a long time, so I know this part of your story. But you ended up transferring at one point. Now
Yeah.
that was before this really active what I would call transfer portal. So walk me through when you made the decision to transfer. Walk me through that decision. Why did you decide to do it? What are the things that you considered? Do you regret it? If you can share with the listeners a little bit about you were evaluating and what you were finding to be an important part of that decision.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, it was a very tough process and honestly a very different lens from the current state of what is the transfer portal and all that. At the time you had to sit out if you went D1 to D1, you had to sit out a year. And so that was something I was weighing, myself was like, is this really something that I want to do, is take another year to not be able to play. I could practice and do all those things. And for me at the time, I felt like it was the best decision, partly due to just my maturation physically and emotionally and all those things. Like, it was more of like a holistic view of like, my ultimate goal was to play professional baseball, was to play at the highest level. So in order to do that, I realized, at this school that I was at, I probably wasn't going to get that ample playing time anyways the next year. And so it might have done me good to go and invest in myself and my body and get it in a mature position, just due to late growth. And it was a really hard choice. And I think it now with the portal, it can very much be like a throw off of like, oh, I'm just going to go to this new school. Well, for someone who's emotionally connected and had passions of going to that particular school, and you have friends, you develop relationships, and sometimes that's not as easy as a transition as just picking up and playing, at that next school. And there's more that goes into it, along with a vital part of that, which is academics, which is kind of sometimes, in my opinion, is the part that gets left behind and is something that you can learn just as much in that classroom at that school as you can, with your teammates in the clubhouse. And so it was a tough decision. It was one that I felt was important at the time, and ended up choosing a school that I felt fit me, and then wildly didn't get to play that next year at the school. Ended up getting drafted the year that I sat out, which is a wild. As a scout now, I talk to my signing scout often, and I'm like, man, I understand what it takes to draft and sign a player and the work that it puts into it, and to take the jump on someone who didn't even play that year requires a lot of conviction. And I'm thankful for that, because it gave me a lot of opportunities that I probably wouldn't have had if he didn't have that conviction, and maybe me as a person and a player at that time. So kind of a different scenario than most, but really was the right call for me, I would say, at that time in my life.
Is the scout that signed you, is he still in the game?
Yeah. So I see him frequently, and works with Kansas City Royals, the team who signed me. And so it was actually a really cool full circle, experience when I started getting into scouting and ended up working in the same territory and region. And so pretty cool to sit at a game with the scout that signed you. And obviously I wasn't a big leaguer on his resume, but he's done so much for me. And I think that's kind of the beautiful part of this game, is you never really know who you're going to impact and who's going to catch back up in life to you, and where you might meet them again. And that's what people say, this world is a small community and a small world, but it's big at the same time. And that's perfect example.
Well, I think part of it too is just the type of person that you are. And this is the compliment. I mean, I've met a lot of scouts, and there are some really great people out there. You're somebody who's, I would say we're like-minded, where we both have what you would call a job, right? But it's not enough, and I'm speaking for us here, it's not enough for either one of us just to clock in and clock out and do our job. We really want to make an impact on the players that we are ultimately involved with on a daily basis. And it sounds like, because I know you've talked really highly of the Kansas City Royals in the past, it sounds like the relationship that you built with the scout and even the relationship that you had, I know that you've told me about with the Royals, whether it was the front office, the general manager at the time, but these people really poured into you as you kind of came into pro ball. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's something that gets lost with a lot of players is, and look, there's no right way or wrong way. It's everybody's personal opinion and decision on why they want to sign, how they evaluate that decision. However, can you talk a little bit about the importance that an organization has when you're drafted and how did that change your trajectory, you feel like?
Yeah, it's vitally important. Like at the end of the day, we're all people, and we all have goals, we all have passions and desires to do great things in our life, hopefully, and also in this game. And so for me, that personal connection is kind of what we all crave as humanity, in my opinion. And what that team did in particular for me was they surrounded me with great people, and people that were coming alongside of you, and not only just speaking into your baseball career, but speaking into your Monday and your Tuesday and your life at home. At the time I was engaged, and so people asking about your wife, and truly taking a look like behind this baseball image, right? And like investing into you, because the short window, when you're a prospect or non-prospect or whatever you are in a system, it's small, it's finite. I mean, it's even major league players. I mean, you're talking about a very small percentage of guys that play these long careers in the major leagues. And you're dealing with a lot more people than just those few people. And so I think there's a misconception out there that like this pro game doesn't invest into people or doesn't, pour into people. I think that yes, there are one-off cases in that regard. It is a business at the end of the day, and you're acquiring, talent to produce and do things on the field. But I'd be remiss to say, like, man, like the emotional side, the amount of money and the amount of resources poured into helping the player become a better person on and off the field, along with like whether that include diet, whether that include emotional resources, whether that include mental strength and conditioning. I mean, those are all vital pieces that really attracted to me when I first came in, and was kind of like, they were leading the charge, I feel like, in the person to person space at that time. And so I was grateful to be a part of an organization that valued that. And ultimately, I think that's where you can get the best out of your players is when you meet them halfway. And that's hard at times because business can be sticky, and we're asking players to do things because we feel it's in their best regard, and people are people, and they might have a different opinion. But at the end of the day, if we can meet as a human and see that there's a heart behind this, and there's family behind this, and these are people's lives. And that's the thing I try to take as a scout is, I go in to meet with a family, a high school kid and his family. I mean, this is his life. If he forgoes college, that's an experience that, he won't have. And I'm aware of that, and want to be aware of that, because that is his life, and want to be, I want to be cautious that I'm not giving information that is leading someone down a road that, I want the best for that person, and whatever that looks like in their situation. So I was shown that. And so that's kind of what I try to emulate, due to that's how it felt nice when I was treated that way.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of parents would understand and empathize with that, probably more so than kids, because, a major league organization, it is a business. And like any business, there are good leaders and bad leaders, but players ultimately, whether they feel this way or not, like they're really employees, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a good leader to guide those employees and guide these players to perform the best and to bring out the best in them. And it sounds like in your experience, you personally saw that. And I can speak to what I've seen with you, just your involvement with players, even just our involvement through this business. You are somebody who really tries to pass that along. and feed those guys the way that I feel like you were fed. If we can move on a little bit, I guess there's a lot of people I would imagine that are listening and they've heard the term scout. They've seen you guys at games, but they don't truly understand kind of the job and what it entails. So the first thing I want to kind of touch on is obviously a major league organization has different levels of scouts. Can you talk about the levels and really how each role is different?
Yeah, for sure. So each one, I appreciate the comments. It's very nice, obviously, but yeah, there's different layers, right? So each team does it a little bit different, and that's kind of the beauty of it. You obviously have your international scouting market, and then you've got your pro scouting market. I've worked in both the pro and amateur space, more so in the amateur, and so I'll speak to the amateur a little bit more, but it's layered in most organizations in a tier type setting, right? You have your area scouts, which is what I did for 6 years with the Cubs, and those are your boots on the ground. Those are your foot soldiers, man. They're the ones that they're really the ones that are the first people to come into contact with the player, or at least you hope they are, to really lay the groundwork for what professional baseball is. And they're the first, true example of that organization, and MLB as a unit. And so, it's a tough job because one, it's a lot of responsibility in that regard, but it's also a tough job because you're trying to cover an area of the country, and your job is to identify the talent in that area, whether it be high school or college, and essentially you're trying to find the best players to fit your organization that can make an impact at the major league level. And obviously the draft has changed even since I went through the draft process in quite a bit, and it doesn't necessarily change the job of the area scout. The job of the area scout is vitally important for any scouting department to operate properly, in the sense of, like, if the area scout is not on top of the area, the rest of the organization can miss out on players, and which is essentially our job, is to find the best players in that area. And so, a lot can be said about area scouts and in so many positive ways, and great stories being told for years about relationships that are made, and I think that's probably the most important. They're the ones that carry that day-to-day relationship with the prospect and with the families, and really driving the information up the ladder. And so it's probably the hardest job in baseball. I would assume. I haven't done every job, but it's got to be. It's one that's taxing and requires a lot of travel. It's a lot of time commitment, but it also teaches you so many things about life outside of baseball, in the sense that you learn time management. You learn a lot of things about yourself on long drives, where you learn about how to be mentally tough and make that double up the next day because you need to see this player. And it's one of those things where you can change the course of an organization by the way that you work. So it's vitally important, and it has its perks. You get to travel, you get to see a lot of really nice places in the country, and you get to watch baseball for a living. So it could be worse. And then
Right.
outside of that, as you work your way up, most chains and organizations, you go into what's called like a regional cross checker, or some teams are calling them coordinators. And basically those are essentially kind of like the middle management type level position, which I'm currently doing on the West Coast for the Tigers. And you're over the area scouts, but you're really being fed the information from the area scouts. They're driving you to the players. They're giving you the info on the guys that need to be seen and kind of worked up the ladder, so to speak. And so, man, like, if the area scout wasn't important, I've learned, I felt like I knew that as an area scout, and now relying on information from area scouts and that communication barrier and how you have to apply that is so important to my current job. And so that's kind of high level, like what a cross checker does. They see more of the top tier talent in that region, and then try to siphon those guys out. And we do pref lists. So each scout is responsible for their own pref list, and we rank these players out. We submit these lists, and we provide all the information according to the player. Now, above me is most teams have national cross checkers. Those guys are responsible more for even mostly like the top 3 rounds of the draft, I would say, and they see the majority of the country. And most teams have a variance of those guys. Some teams have 1, 2, and then upwards of 4. And then you're working your way into the front office after that level, which is the scouting directors, the assistant scouting directors, and then obviously the analysts that play in a huge part of the draft today, and then which feeds straight into your GM and your AGMs and your president, and that's kind of the chain of command. I would say information flows a lot of different directions, and from up to down to making calls in every different way. So it requires a great deal of communication and a lot of knowledge on the player base from year to year.
So it sounds like there's obviously a ton of what I would call kind of checks and balances, right? It's a process. It's something that if it's broken at any level, obviously the whole process is going to be thrown off. And, you mentioned earlier kind of the challenge of the area scout role. And like I've seen it firsthand, and I know it still, I would say, exists probably in your current role, which is you guys can spend an entire year. Because Alex, when will you start? Like, when is the first chance you're really going to look at a current draft class? Like, give me the month.
Yeah, well, it kind of, I like to always watch. Like, I'm always watching. So it's college guys. This year's been a little different for me. I'm doing a different region of the country than I've normally done. So I've done a lot of video work this year in terms of preparation for this draft class, just due to my last job was more in the pro scouting space. And so I didn't have as clear of a picture of this draft class coming into it. But in a traditional year, the high school stuff is kind of after this current draft is over. And actually now, before the draft is over, due to the later draft, we start working on next year's class already. So
Right.
We're working and as an area scout, you're always watching, right? So if you're at a college game, you're identifying the freshmen, the sophomores, and the soon to be juniors or seniors that will be drafted every year. You're tracking them. And most of those guys, you're having history dating back to youth baseball, into high school baseball, into their travel teams. And so you're trying to, ultimately what you're trying to do is build this long history on the player, which gives you a better representation of one, the tools of the player, which really drive the player as with his upside, and then obviously the emotional side of the player and what we would identify as makeup. And so I think as a cross checker, I'm normally starting on the high school class for the next year before this draft is even started. And that goes for most of the summer. We check in on those guys in the fall. And then obviously the big workload is in the spring leading up to the summer draft. And then the college guys, it works pretty similar. The top guys, we go to the Cape, we go to Team USA, we go to the Appalachian League now, we go to the draft league, we go to all of these things to identify these guys in these other settings, along with then being able to scout them in the fall at their colleges, and then being able to scout them again in the spring. And it's our job to keep track with the player. It's not the player's responsibility to notify us of, hey, we transferred schools. That's always nice when you get those messages first and you're able to hop on the trail early. But we're responsible for all things on the player, and that starts really whenever the player wants to hit us in the face with the right tools. So
exactly. And I think, number one, I'm going back to the difficulty I think that really all scouts have is, you devote so much time and energy, whether that's just being on the road, but looking at these kids over and over. And as you said, it's over a year's worth, maybe in some cases, multiple years. And it all comes down to 3 days. And then you find out maybe all that work was for nothing. Right?
yeah.
Now I know you guys gather these scouting reports and obviously maintain those scouting reports. So you always have looks on these kids for the future. But I can only imagine having been or being in your position thinking like, look, man, I really wanted that kid. Oh man, this is frustrating, right? But I guess talk a little bit about, I think most families and players will see how the way a scouting organization, or an organization rather, the way that they divide their scouts up, how that benefits a team. It allows them to kind of cover the country. There are checks and balances, as I said. How do you think that setup helps players? And by that, I mean, you guys, and I oftentimes talk to some families who are so concerned with exposure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, I think the hierarchy of families, even going to 12 years old, is a little bit backwards. Their first focus on the exposure, number one. Number two is probably the competition. And then the third thing that really kind of just floats around and they really don't know how to prioritize it is the development. They know it's important. They just don't know how and what to do to make that a priority. And what I've seen with teams is the way that you guys are set up, if a player's good enough, you're going to find them. Now, it obviously helps if they're going to certain events. But do you believe that the way an MLB organization is set up with their scouts, that it does benefit these families and these players because they can be seen?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a complicated question because I think as an industry, we go to these events because we go where players are, right? So we're going to always go where the players are, and that's our job. So what it does is it can drive a narrative that you have to be at these events to be seen. And that's not the case. I will say, like, every year we get to the spring and there's some guy that was not on the circuit. Not just one guy. There's a lot of guys that weren't on these, the circuit events, which are fantastic events because one, you get them all in one place, a lot of good players in one place. That's helpful. It's our job as scouts to identify players wherever they are. It doesn't matter if you're playing rec league, it's like, if there's talent, we will find you. Now, I think what that does for the player is it makes it hard, especially for families, like prioritizing one, like money, and like just resources to be able to get these kids to places. Like, it's almost like I feel most organizations are prioritizing getting a lot of looks at these players, right? And so how do we do that? Well, we have a big array of scouts, and that requires teamwork, which also kind of drives me back to the point of what you were saying is that's probably got to be like a gut punch. You do this work all year on these players. And I think what I try to keep in mind is it's that me versus we attitude. And like, this is a we thing. If one of a scout on my team sees a player on the East Coast that he thinks is quality and thinks is a major league prospect, by all means, man, you submit that report and please drive that player, because this is we, right? Like, this is about, if you're a part of a team and a part of an organization, like if we just had one thought and one mind making all the decisions, I think that kind of dilutes the beauty of the essence of people, right? It's like, when we come together, we can do really good things, which leads me back to the youth baseball and just like this whole movement and prioritizing these things is like, we will prioritize seeing a player regardless of where they are, right? And we have the people to do that and the resources. So I guess to answer your question, yeah, these events drive some of our looks and they drive a lot of what we do. That's not going to limit us from finding you wherever you may be. And so it's almost a freedom to some families, I would say, like, man, keep doing. If you feel like staying and playing with your high school summer team is a good thing, like that's okay. And some kids, they do get to college because we didn't get to them, and that just happens. And that might be the best thing for that kid. Will we ever know that? I don't know. But that's sometimes what the case is. So there's nothing wrong with not doing these tournaments. There's nothing wrong with doing the tournaments. I will say you got to do what's best for the individual that's in your home, and what's ready for their physical and emotional space.
I guess to be clear, I certainly know it's not black and white, right?
Yeah.
It's not easy enough to say, don't go to any events ever until you're 17. And no matter what, if everybody follows that plan, you're going to be fine. Obviously, there are different factors at play, but I do think it's important for parents and players to hear that, because I think there's this FOMO, there's this fear of missing out at 12, 13, 14 years old, because all of these guys' buddies are going to these events on these travel teams. And it's not that, go to an event here and there, and that's fine. Because again, I think the second thing on that hierarchy is the competitiveness, right? But you want to focus on the development. You then want to use competitiveness to kind of test it. And then the result of all of that is you're going to get the exposure at the right time.
Right. Yeah, it's a byproduct. It's a byproduct of correct development leading into competitive environment, which is what we're always trying to see these guys in, because at the top level, you're constantly competing. That is what you get paid to do, right? Is to compete. And which then drives the exposure. If you're competing and you're playing, that's what we're going to come watch, right? And like there's a place and a time to see you train and to do all those things. Our hope is that your fundamentals and your teaching happens and gets you to a place to where you're competing, to where then we can evaluate you. And then we can also evaluate you from your training aspect too. But I think the focus and the impotence on getting to these tournaments at a young age and to do all these things, you're not missing out. It actually fires me up when, say, a kid that I'm in the process, he plays in the summer and I see him at an event, or he says, "Hey, I've got football practice and I can come to 2 days of East Coast Pro, and then I'm going to go play football for 2 days." I'm like, this kid's got some balance. Like, I love this about him. He's going to be able to handle something else besides baseball, because at some point baseball won't always be there. And he's prioritizing what also is important to him. And it fires me up because I'm like, all right, cool. Now I can go evaluate this guy in another competitive environment. I can tell that he cares about some of these people as well, which gives me a broader scope of like, this guy's emotional well-being is like, it's greater than this guy who wouldn't be able to handle two sports. And it's like, so there's positives to both sides. You can look at it and frame it a lot of different ways. But sometimes when guys say no, it actually makes me more intrigued, because I'm
Right.
like, hey, this guy knows what he wants and he's after it. It's kind of like he's disciplined and he's ready for what he wants to do.
So you just brought up something that I think is fascinating, and it's a huge disagreement amongst families in my experience, at least recently, which is, should they play multiple sports? Should these kids in high school play multiple sports? And again, it's not black and white. It's not good enough to say, yes, everybody should play multiple sports. But if you have a kid who really has a desire to play baseball, obviously, and then maybe football or basketball, do you like, and it sounds like you just answered that, but I'd like to hear more about it. Do you like when a kid is able to do multiple things? How is that valuable? And, yeah, a kid plays varsity basketball, let's just say, as a junior or a senior. Are you going to his basketball games too? I don't know how many, but are you going to go watch him in that environment?
Yeah, for me personally, like, I love when guys play multiple sports. One, because I just was a kid who played sports all the time. So it's like I love, as a scout, as just like a holistic athlete, I love watching guys compete on different levels. And like, I think for me it starts with identifying, like, the draft for me is not the finish line. The draft realistically is just the starting line for these players. And I think as an industry, sometimes we like view the draft. It's like, okay, now it's final. Like, we got into the draft. Woo! It's over. It's like, no, like, his career is just beginning. So my hope is almost that, due to like development, I hope that we are now placing them into development's hands. So it's almost like I would rather them play multiple sports and have less baseball in their background, especially for pitchers. It's like, man, I would rather that guy play football and basketball, have less toll and less priority on that. And now we can apply the athlete and the aptitude to now just one thing as he's working his way into a pro thing. And so, yes. And to answer your question, I loved going to see guys play basketball or guys go play football. I mean, I remember going and watching Gunnar Henderson play basketball and just watching him slam on kids, and like, it was like amazing to me. I'm like, that's where I really, in the summer, I would say, I'd be lying if I was like, man, this guy is a great athlete. I was like, he's big, he's strong, he's got upside, he's young. But then when I went to watch him play basketball, I'm like, oh, this guy's like a beast. Like, he's like going to be really explosive. Like, to watch him dunk with ease and, in Selma, Alabama, and just
Mm-hmm.
watch him to, driving in the middle of nowhere. And one night in December, getting to see him compete on that level, it was like, okay, yeah, he's telling you something, right? And so it can almost make your trajectory even go that much quicker, rather than prioritizing. And that's not for everybody. Some guys need to do that because they're so mind. That's how their mind works, and I'm okay with that. I think it's more of just communicating that and realizing what you need as an individual.
Well, when both of us were coming up, I mean, yeah, I played multiple sports. You played multiple sports. I think it was normal. But
Yeah.
somewhere along the way, I think with the advent of travel baseball and again, players feeling like this needs to be a year-round thing, they stopped doing it out of fear that, oh, we have to hurry up and do all of this other stuff because if we don't, other guys will, and now we're going to miss out. And so I think as an industry, I think whether it's teams, agents, just families, like I think everybody would benefit from kids really slowing this thing down and trusting the process, knowing if I'm good enough and I put my work in, like I'm going to have a future. It's going to develop. It's going to happen. It obviously takes a lot of hard work, but I don't think fear should come into the equation at 13 years old. And because of fear, that's why you're shutting other sports down.
Yeah, it's definitely not a feeling or anything that you want driving your decisions. Fear is ultimately going to put a stopgap to you at some point, right? And as you mature in age, like you realize that you can't work from that place. And I think the FOMO is real. The rankings are real, and those things, they are accounted for. We look at those things, but it's not ultimately what drives my decision on a player, right? I think the beauty of my job is that I can come up with my own list, whether right or wrong. Having conviction in that is what I strive for, right? And the reasons behind why I have the rankings that I have compared to maybe a publication or something that is producing something. Those aren't right or wrong. They're indifferent. It's everyone's opinion on the player. That should not drive a player to not go to a tournament or to go to a tournament. At the end of the day, my hope for the player and for every individual, honestly, and just the society is to be where their feet are, like be present where you are and like be the best you on whatever team you're on, compete the hardest for whatever team you are playing for. And then through that comes the exposure, then comes us being able to identify that. And then when we get that real authentic you, that helps us paint a really clear picture around the player and the person to be able to say like, yeah, that's the guy that I want to take, and I want him to become a Detroit Tiger, and I want him to like lead the charge on the major league field one day, because that's the real authentic person, which is what we're after all along. And so working out of a place of fear is only going to inhibit that, a little bit more.
Right. Speaking about the rankings, because this is something that is debated quite a bit. I think, my personal opinion, if families and players approached rankings more logically, right? So you're a scout. What's more logical? That you look at a ranking from an organization, whether it's PBR, Perfect Game, or whatever it is, and you say, oh, this kid's ranked high, so he must be the number one overall kid in the country. Or is it, okay, this is going to inform my decision. If this kid's ranked number one, I definitely need to go take a look. But just because he's ranked number one doesn't make you in your mind think, oh, he's definitely the number one kid then, right? And that's where
Right.
for me, it's like, it's more logical. It makes sense. You want the information, but you're going to have your own set of eyes and your own, position that you'll back up on why you think a kid is worth what you think a kid is worth.
Yeah, and it's a tool, right? Like I appreciate the work that people put into those rankings. It takes a lot of work in it, and it takes their own identification process, and but also I'm not always privy to their process and how they accumulate their information to come up with those rankings. The one thing that I can control, which is what I hope that we all can work on as humanity, is just controlling what we can control. And so I use it as a tool for sure. There's a lot of great information out there, and oftentimes, come into contact with a lot of these people that put these lists together. And I think it's a two-way street at times. People ask for information. Who knows where some of this information is coming from, and whether good, bad, indifferent, those lists are formulated. And so, yeah, if a kid is ranked high, sure, I would probably look at that and go, all right, yeah, it sounds like an intriguing guy. Let me look into the reasons why, and then I'm going to go evaluate that player and come up with, hopefully, with an opinion for myself, and be able to drive that and support it based off of my own instincts and feel and decision making skills, which you come to on your own. It's everybody has those things that they learn and value in their own application and their own identification process that drive their rankings and their reports. And so I think that would be, if I'm a scout and if I'm, if you're leading scouts, I would hope I would drive the narrative of like, find what works for you and find the true info, find the real info, talk to the players, talk to the people that are around them, talk to everyone that this player may come into contact with. What's really making this player up and what are his true skills? And let that be an outpouring of your pref list and your rankings.
And a counterpoint to that is if there's a player who isn't ranked, that doesn't inform you as well. That doesn't tell you, oh, if he's not ranked, oh, he must not be any good. You're still going to, if you've heard good things about him, you're still going to get your own eyes on him.
Yeah, well, for certain. In fact, it's nice sometimes when they're not, because it allows you to, we're all competitors, man. I'd be lying if I didn't say I wanted to beat everyone at this thing. And I wanted to sign the best players to ever play. And so sometimes I use that as motivation of, you can't scout out of that thing alone, right? Like you can't just be like, well, this guy's unranked, so I want him, I want him higher. I want to beat the industry. It's like, no, like there's got to be reasons and justification behind that. But what it does do is it allows you the space to maybe operate and get closer to the player without the notoriety and maybe be able to beat the other teams. And so it can also be a tool in your toolbox to drive your process as well.
So let's get into actually like what I would call kind of the fundamentals of scouting. So if I'm a dad and I am watching my son at a field, any game, and Alex McClure shows up to the field or any scout, like walk me through, if my son's a pitcher and he's starting the game, walk me through what any dad can expect to see you doing.
Good question. And every scout's different in this. My process is probably different than a lot of people, but we all kind of essentially do the same stuff. As well, I'll get there early. I try to get there as early as I can, right? And that process starts, hopefully by identifying the player in the summer and the fall, and then getting in the home of that player, being able to create relationship and obviously like transparency with the family and with the kid. So that way, when I do show up at the field in the spring or the summer or wherever that may be, I'm able to be able to say hello and they recognize who I am. And then so it can be easy. I could go up and start with a conversation if the parent's there or with the player if that's allowed. And then usually I work my way into scouting the player, which if it's a pitcher, in particular high school pitcher, I like to see everything that guy does. So from the time he puts his cleats on to his warm-up routine, to his transition into the bullpen, try to go down to the bullpen if you can get down there. And as you know, every ballpark in the country is built differently. So sometimes you may see me climbing a fence, or you may see me just trying to camp out in the stands and watch from afar. And so I try to watch his routine. I try to look behind the, I guess if you're opening up the hood of a car and you're trying to get to the nitty gritty of what the player does and why he does it, I'm trying to identify all those things. And why does he do band work? Why does he do heavy balls? Why does he do a crow hop before he throws? It's identifying how good of a mover this guy is. So I'm taking all these things and it's kind of like a swirling thing of information and then trying to boil it down to how does he prepare? And then when he gets on the mound, how does he compete and what does he compete with? So then that would transition me getting behind the plate to how I take notes and, I start to grade out the pitches and to which he has to offer. And I use multiple tools, whether it be a radar gun or we use data now a lot. You're able to identify pitch shapes and how this guy's attacking hitters with metrics and velocity. And then I think for me, what drives me ultimately with pitching, in particular high school pitching, is the movements, man. Like the body movements. How good of an athlete is this player really? How good are his hips? How good are the mobility in his shoulder? Like where is he at plant? These are all check boxes that I'm looking for every time I watch these pitchers throw. And what's the arm swing look like? And the ability to repeat those things, to stay athletic and to move down the mound in an efficient manner, and pitching in particular, is vital for my evaluation. And so that's part of my look. I then watch how he competes, and I'm grading each pitch out and trying to decide what the present value of that pitch is and what I feel like the future outcome could be, whether it be development or subtraction, and how he might fit in our player development system. So I vary around the ballpark. I don't love to sit in the same place all the time. I like to get different vantage points, whether it be down the line to see arm path, or whether it be behind home, or whether it be camping out right next to the dugout to see how this guy reacts when he comes off the field after a bad inning, or how he treats his teammates, or it's down the line listening to parents talk about the player. It's like we try to get a full lens, a full scope of his surroundings, and what really drives this player.
And I guess for a position player, how does that differ?
Yeah, so a lot of the same things I'm looking for exterior, right? Like all of the same compete and all of those things. For a hitter, it probably starts a little earlier. I usually try. I like to come into pitching to like fresh, like with not a ton of video. I like maybe to look at maybe some numbers and to see like just baseline, like how's the guy performing, but not letting that drive my evaluation. Whereas an offensive player, you're getting there early to watch batting practice, right, and watch how the swing works. Like when the ball slowed down, is he sped up? Is he, how consistent can his contact point be? How can he manipulate the barrel? Can he use the other side of the field? How easy does he get to power? Those are all things that I look for in the early going. And then just basic, like, is this guy a good mover? Is he a good athlete? Can he load efficiently and get into a good space to hit to be able to like get the most out of his swing? And whatever that player looks like. If it's a guy who's got a line drive swing, that's fine. If that's the type of player he is, I want to see this guy. How does he maximize the most out of his potential and not trying to be someone that he's not? And so it's looking for those type of characteristics. And then in the game, I obviously try to get a lot of different variants of vantage points. I get behind home to see where their front side's going. I get to the side to see how their hands are working. I mean, there's advantages to video work as well, and being able to see from behind the pitcher and seeing how these guys react to spin and to fastball. And there's a lot of tools to use to be able to identify players and to be able to come up with your evaluation of the player. And I think by not using all of them, you got to find what works well for you, but also be willing and capable. I would feel, by always challenging yourself to learn new things, to use all the info that you can to gather the full picture of the player.
If there's a player that you go and watch and you look at him and you're like, look, this kid is special. He's definitely a guy that I think he has the potential to be a top 1 or 2 rounder, top 3 rounder. And I know it's not as easy to say, oh yeah, I need to see him this many times. But is there a certain number of times where, if that's how you and your organization views him, how many looks, and you could speak generally, you don't have to give me like the Detroit Tigers view is, but just generally speaking, how many times do you feel like you need to be in and see that kid to think at the end of the day, come draft day, we would be comfortable taking this guy in that range?
I always used to try to use, and I still do. It's a little bit harder as a cross checker, just due to you're covering a bigger territory, and you're trying to manage 4 different people's areas rather than just your own area. And as you work your way up, that player pool becomes a lot tighter. So you may not be able to spend as much time on that player. From an area scout's perspective, I would always try to, as best as I could, try to do, the early, middle, and late look, right? You identify them early. If there's something that lights you up, you're obviously coming back. Okay, I got to get back to them in the middle of their season at least. And then obviously being able to follow back in on the backside. And one to finish the process of the player, and like I said, that starts way ahead. But when it comes down to the spring, I try to use a general format of like early, middle, and late, letting that drive my looks of the player. There's obvious guys every year that you can tell right away. It's like, okay, we have interest, smaller amount of interest. We're not going to spend as much time on this player as we may on this type of player, which we may value a little bit higher at that time. Not to say this guy might actually end up, in a lot of cases, it happens all the time. He might go to college and end up better than the guy that we spent more time on. And for whatever reason, that sometimes happens, and give it to the player, right? And it could be for a lot of different reasons. And signability, there's just so much that goes into it. But for a general scope, I always try to stick to like the early, middle, and late. Is like, if I can get 3 quality looks on this player, and I can get some sort of like workout or some sort of supplement look, I know I'm going to have a solid process, because over the course of 3 different looks, you're hopefully going to see what this player is when he fails and what he is when he succeeds. And I think baseball is a hard enough sport to give you that. And now, if it's a player that you're going to take with your first pick, I would always try to see them as frequent. The more questions you have on the player, the more you need to see them. And that's kind of how it works. And so, especially with high school guys, there's just a lot more guesswork realistically that we have on those guys, because if you go to college, you kind of are what you are. Like, your numbers are going to tell you. You just have less bargaining power at the end of your college career. Whether right or wrong, I'm not saying college is better than high school or high school is better than college. It is what it is. You go to college and you do what you do. That's how we're going to value you, and like, is there still upside and projection left to those guys? Absolutely. Will they get better after college? Plenty of cases, for sure. But it gives us more of a baseline and more of a track record to not have to make such a big decision. So the high school guys, I try to see more frequently than the college, just because I'm able to get access to the college guys even from video or from other areas as well, where I can provide supplement looks.
So outside of obviously watching them play the game itself, and whether that's hitting in cages and doing all that stuff, I want to talk a little bit about the term that is often thrown around, which is makeup. Can you talk about what makeup is and shed some light on the importance of makeup in in scouts' evaluations of players?
Yeah, makeup's a touchy one, man, because ultimately at the end of the day, tools drive the player for me. You could have the best tools and never get to your upside, or you could have the worst tools and get to huge upside, right? And makeup can be defined for me on field and off field. If you have great on field makeup, I've played with a lot of guys and seen a lot of good players who would be defined as bad makeup, and whatever that is, right? Like, most of the time it's identified as like, is he a good kid or bad kid? And I'm not so sure that's what makeup really is, right? Like, there's on-field makeup for me, and then there's off-field makeup. The on-field makeup is completely separate, in my opinion. It's like, how good is this player? What are his tools? What are his upside? How good does he compete? How well is he, like, just, able to just give his best effort on the field with all the tools and athleticism that he has? And how is he in a clubhouse? And then there's like this, like, that's the baseball side, which can drive a player to a really high player. He can be a great big leaguer and have bad off the field makeup. And so I think my goal is to identify both sides. If I can identify, this kid does this, he does this really well on the field, he also does this really well off the field, he does this bad off the field, and he does this bad on the field. If I can identify both of those, we know what we're working with, right? Like I had a really good boss that used to say, like, we can coach hat, right? Like, don't kill, like, this guy's skill may be really good, but if he wears his hat backwards getting off the bus, let's not eliminate that player just because he does that. There could be a lot that goes into why he does that, right? And like, by single-handedly ruling him out for one certain thing that he or she does, it's like, I try to get away from that as much as possible and separate the two, because I want to give that player, I try to full process, right? Let's scout him till the end, being that, make him prove to us that his makeup is so bad that we should rule him out, even if his tools are this good. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to acquire really good tools. We're trying to acquire really good talent, a product that we can place on our major league field and provide really good value, or also provide value to where we can get someone in return for that player, right? And that's the business side. But we also need people that are quality human beings in our organization. And that's also the part that you have to counter when I would imagine when you're taking these players. I've never picked players. Those are the things I try to provide information on, so the people picking players can have all the information in front of them, so you can make the best decision possible. It's like buying a house or making an investment. I want every piece of information, whether good or bad. We can deal with some of this if we know we're getting this, or we can deal with some of this if we know we're getting this, because this makeup could really drive this guy, even with the lack of tools that he might have. So that's my approach.
No, and I think it makes perfect sense. Do they pay attention to a player's social media?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, teams, as social media has become more abundant, and it's like, gosh, like, what a tough space, honestly, for young kids who I mean, there's been plenty of research to show that our brains aren't fully developed until obviously much later than we would probably hope. And to have the autonomy to be able to tweet or to put pictures up, it's like, who am I to question what a 16-year-old's going to put on his Instagram? I don't know if I'm able to do that, but also if he does it, there also is consequence at times for actions, right? Like that's just society in general. So yes, we have people that monitor it. I mean, there's teams that have whole teams to do this, right? And it's not so much of like a, you know, we're not taking you if you do this. It's like, let's have a conversation around this and get to the real root of, I would hope that this is how teams approach it, is like, let's get to the root of what this does. And then sometimes there's non-negotiables. Like there are things that we might not want to have you represent. We might not want to have you represent our club if we feel that you feel this way, or whatever, vice versa. And that's just, I don't know, that's the nature of the beast, right? Like you got to know what you're investing in, and before you do it. So yes, we look at all parts of the human, on and off the field. We try to get to the bottom of it as much as we can.
So I want to talk about in-home visits.
Yeah, love it.
Obviously, that's something that, and correct me if I'm wrong, primarily area scouts are handling the in-home visits, right? What are some things that are important to you when you go into an in-home visit, or when you did go into in-home visits, that you're really trying to, I know you're gathering information, but can you walk me through kind of what your approach is?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the landscape of an in-home visit has changed, post COVID. There's a lot of teams that are really utilizing Zoom and these like media platforms, which they should, because you're now able to bring in different people into a space with the player and the family, whether it be an executive or whether it be your scouting director, or your cross checker, or a mental skills coach, or a player development person. I mean, it's opened up a wide variety of being able to get hands on this player and minds on this player to see what he is, or if it's a great fit. But with that being said, I also am like a huge advocate for the area scout in-home traditional visit, because you're creating a relationship with the player, which drives everything in scouting, right? Like if you don't feel comfort with that player, it's really hard to say like, yeah, let's invest in this player. But what I would look for, like, always in a home visit is, one, like, how natural are they? Like, can they carry a conversation with an adult? How do they treat their parents? How do they treat their siblings? What's their being like? Like what does their room look like? Like what does their space? All the things that, like, their day-to-day life, when we sign this player and we send them to West Michigan, or we send them to Lakeland to our spring training facility. Like, can this kid make his bed? Like, can he do that on his own? Like, what does his day-to-day look like? And I've had the funniest of home visits, where you show up and, the kid watching a movie while you're meeting with him, you're like, maybe he might not be mentally ready, or maybe it's like, this guy was so engaged and he had great conversation and he was prepared. He had questions. There was like, there are cues that you kind of pick up on as you're there, and you're seeing him operate in his day-to-day space, just like we all would if someone were to come into your home and they're like, oh, okay. You get a general sense or a feeling of the player, the person, or the family, which can ultimately drive you to a conviction level at the end of the day. And so, I look at everything. I take it all in. If they're going to let me in, hey, I'm looking at it. It's, if they'll, as much as they'll let me, and I'll ask the questions, which is like, you can tell me just to back off if you need to. I don't think I ever got to a point where I was asking questions that were uncalled for, but it's like, hey, I see you got that food over there. Is that yours, or is that your parents? And so you're kind of like, as a scout, I try to like take it all in, and then I try to just funnel it down of like, all right, what's the most important? What's the most important? What's the most important? And then you hopefully get to a point at the end where you're like, I've gathered everything, and now I've got a full, complete process that started early. I got a middle, and this is the whole thing. And then I'm finishing the process to hand over to get not to the finish line, but to the starting line, which is player development. And what we're trying to do is develop major league players, on and off the field. And that's like the person involved as well.
If you had a son who was 17 years old, he's going to be draft eligible, this season, and you've got in-home visits going on right now, and you had a scout come into your house, what are the questions? I don't know, is there one or two questions that you would want to ask that scout, or even have the player ask the scout? What would those be?
The advantage of a lot of teams currently is that uh, they're out dueling each other, man. You're starting to see the player really be taken care of, from like a financial standpoint, from like a food necessities, housing standpoint, which is like outstanding for the players and awesome on teams in general. It's just when you're well taken care of, you're able to give your best on the field, and I love that we've prioritized that now, and I feel like it's super important. That would be a question for me, like is like, what does that look like, right? Like if my kid is bypassing going to college, where will he be? Like what's he going to eat? What how does that look like? How does that operate? What does the living look like? I think when you're rested, when you have proper nutrition and you have proper sleep, and you have all these things that are vital to just being a human being day to day, that would be a huge question for me. Is like, what does that look like for your organization, and how does that going to help my son or daughter? And then also, I think the other big thing is like, what off the field, like what people do you have in your organization that are going to, like what other things, like is whether it be mental health, whether it be emotional well-being, and then like nutrition goes into that. Like, what does that look like? Because at times we're talking about high school kids, right? Like 17, 18 years old, being away from their family. You're talking about college kids who've maybe been through hard things, or they're coming out of a program that was a different way. And when you get thrust into something that is demanding, that is tiring, and that expects a lot of you, it can be challenged to your mental health. And so I think that's like the next step of like, okay, the teams that are really doing these things well are providing the full landscape for the player. It's like at the individualized, I would want to know, like, what does the player plan for my son or daughter look like? Which is like, is it catered to that person, or is it catered to a group of people? I've seen the ones that are really, it seems like, I think like we'll never know until these things continue to work themselves out. This like individualized player plan seems to be like a very good thing for players, because one, it attests to what's going on in that player's life and what that player needs at that particular moment, compared to this player who might need something completely different at that moment. And whether that be in the mental health space, whether that be on the field, and whether that be off the field, whether it be living arrangements or whatever, those are the questions that I would be asking. It would, and obviously, if I was a pitcher, you can take it into the baseball side. Pitching is a whole different thing, and along with pitching development comes the hitting side too, which is now taking leaps and bounds with a lot of new data, a lot of new technology. I would want to know, who are the coaches, and like what are their thought systems around what this could look like if my son or daughter was in your system.
So on that note, I know we just talked about obviously in homes, and you kind of touched a little bit on player development and some things that matter. Just taking one step back real fast. If you had a kid who, I want to talk about two different types of players. A kid that you think has the chance to go really high in the draft, and then a kid who, let's just say, is anywhere from round 8 to round 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you were designing their summer schedules as their father, how would those schedules look like? And I'm talking about high school players.
Let's see. I mean, I think for the most part, I would play, right? Like your summer, you just got to play. Like there's a lot of guys that have taken tournaments off, and I think that's fine for pitching. Like in particular pitching, like I think arm health is this budding topic, right? And I'm not so sure anyone really knows the answer. I think we're all trying to figure it out, and hopefully we're making advancements to being able to like prioritize youth arms to be able to like get their potential and not be injured. But I would prioritize just like competing, like getting out there, getting in the tournaments, like whether it be East Coast Pro, area codes, a perfect game event, or a Legion tournament. We're like in a couple months, I'll be scouting like a Legion tournament. Like, I don't even know if people think that we do that, but like there's parts of the country that are still playing Legion, and there's good players. And like, it's our job to find those players. And like, I would just say, like, you got to play to be seen, right? Like, there's only so much I can do off of a bullpen. right? Like you can like a guy off of a bullpen, but I need to see you compete in a game ultimately. And so if I'm a high school parent, I'm designing a flexible schedule, one that goes to the events, one that plays, but also I want to design a space in that summer for my son to be a high school kid or my daughter to be a high school kid to where they can go on a vacation, like take a week, like you
Mm-hmm.
don't need to be in a tournament every week. Like go on a vacation, be with your brothers and sisters, be with your family. Like when you leave after your senior year, at that time is just, it's harder to get back. Right. So when you're there, like you've got to prioritize it and you've got to put that time in. Like, yes, go play a lot of baseball because that's where you're going to get seen. Also, like take a weekend off. It's going to be all
Right.
right. You know,
Yeah.
like,
There still needs to be balance. Right.
yes.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say, it makes a lot of sense. It's, look, if you have the chance to be really good and you think you want to you want to take your best shot, you're not going to fool anybody into drafting you really, really high. Right.
No.
So if you believe that you have the capability of being a top pick, you've got to be willing to go out there and compete against the best players over and over and over again and not shy away from that. But with that being said, once you've gone to several events and you've now done that, don't feel like there's no time you can take off if mom and dad want to go on a vacation. That makes perfect sense.
We want to watch you compete. 2 years ago, there was a whole draft class of high school kids that I just like. You loved them. They were at every event. They loved to play. Like you could just see it. It was evident. They wanted to be there. They played in every event. And so you like by the end of the summer, you're like, I know these guys, like because they've
Right.
shown us like all summer, right? Like they competed against each other all summer. I've also seen with that same group, they weren't afraid to just like do things that really mattered to them too. And that's so important. It's the well-rounded human that ultimately gets to the upside.
Yeah, that makes sense. How would you advise players to deal with scouts?
Yep. Personally, get like, I love when a guy just like will talk to me, I understand the need for protection, right? Like the need for an agent, the need for parents to get involved. It's vital because yes, you are a high school kid and you're talking to an adult, right? There should be some sort of like barrier there. But I love when guys communicate or they do things for themselves. It doesn't even have to be talking to me, or if there's a boundary on a home visit, totally fine. Get it. I want that. I want that for the player, for their safety, for all the things. But when a guy sends out his own email to say, hey, I'm pitching next Friday at this time on the scout email groups, it's like, man, this guy like wants me to come. Like he's taking initiative and showing initiative. Or like, hey, Mr. McClure, I know you've showed interest in me in the past. I'll be playing in this tournament this summer. Hope you can see me play. You got it, man. That makes me want to come see that player. You're not bugging us by giving us information. We love information and we want to get to know you as best as possible. So the more chances we have to do that, we're going to take them. Right. And obviously, hopefully at a respectful boundary that as an industry we can carry to give that person the space that they need to be a person, but also to get and be around the player to have a really good conviction on the player. And so I think when guys show the willingness, whether it's like, hey, BP, they send out BP times. It's like, hey, I've got this time slots set up this winter for meeting. Please take one of these times. I love that. It's upfront. It's honest. It's open. I know what to expect. It's hard when there's no communication because now we're going to keep pestering because that's what we get paid to do is to try to find out about you as a player. And then it puts both sides in a bad spot. And I think honestly, no one as a human likes that feeling of being in that space. And so, I love when guys are just honest. Just be honest. If you want to do it, you want to do it. If you don't, that's fine too. No skin off my back, man. There's a time and a place. And honestly, some guys want to go to college. That's great. I went to college. I get it.
Right.
And some guys need college and some guys don't. And I don't think it has to be a this or a that.
Either or, right.
Exactly.
Yeah. I feel like I have a really good sense on the things that a player needs to do to put himself in the best position based on the things that you've shared with me today in order to be drafted and really give himself that opportunity. Is there any one thing that a parent or a player could do where you're just like, you're off my list?
Um, well, I would say I'm a little biased due to being a dad of three girls, right? And so I would personally, maybe not our team or, people making decisions above me. I have a hard time with disrespect just to your peers, man. Like, whether it be a woman or whether it be a male or whatever, like blatant disrespect is kind of one of those things for me that you may not be off my list, but it's definitely going to be a talking point, right? Like we're going to have a conversation around it at some point, or about the instance or whatever it may be. I think just blatant disrespect to your peers or to your family, I think it's a hard one to navigate, because I think it might point to something that might be deeper that we might also need to explore, and that might not be my responsibility. Ultimately, that's on the player to do that. But like I said, I try to scout these guys. My goal with the player is to give every player or every person the benefit of the doubt until they show me that there's obvious concerns, or there are things that might be non-negotiables, and every instance is different. I really don't want to box in what that thing is outside of like blatant disrespect. I personally don't love when that happens.
Yeah, I mean that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and look, I think it also depends on, what is the instance? When did it happen? If something happened, let's say at 15 years old, and again, depending on the degree to which it happened, if
Mm-hmm.
something happened at 15 and the player has since matured and he's
Mm-hmm.
owned the mistake, who is he grown into becoming? Like, there's obviously things that a player can overcome, but I certainly hear your point that, yeah, I mean, if there's something that this player has done and isn't taking any accountability for it and merely making excuses, saying like, "Look, not my fault. It was this guy or this woman did it or whatever."
Right. Yeah. I mean, and ultimately, I think as a scouting industry, as an industry, we hope the best for players. Like we no one wants someone to be in a bad spot, right? Or not be able to deal with things when they come about, but also being open to the idea that sometimes those things don't change, or they might change later, and
Right.
that could indicate a decision that we have to make ultimately.
We're starting to wrap up here. I have a couple more questions that I do want to ask you. Something that I think is really confusing for parents sometimes, and I kind of want to just lay this hypothetical out there. So you have a kid who, we don't need to talk about the level at which he plays, but he's got area scouts at a ton of his games.
Mm-hmm.
And I've oftentimes talked to these families, and there's this automatic assumption that, oh, the area scouts are here, I'm getting drafted. And they start going down that path, right? Of, this is all going to work out. I'm getting drafted. I'm going to be a first rounder. This is just how it's going to go. And oftentimes, and it's not easy to do, but it's helping them understand, look, a couple of things that we talked about on the podcast today. There are different levels of scouts. Who's the scout that's there? Has any cross checker been in to see you? Has the director been in to see you? It's managing the expectation. If the player thinks he's going to be a first rounder, then obviously the scouting director is going to have to come in and place eyes on him at some point, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's necessarily a question here. It's more about just this dynamic exists where families and players are oftentimes led by what they see, and the attention that they're getting on a daily basis gets them really excited. And I've seen that situation play out where the kid is left disappointed at the end of the day, because while they thought they were going to be a top 3 rounder, they ended up really not being offered much of anything. And then they ended up going to college disappointed.
Right.
That does happen.
Yeah, it does, and sometimes it's the nature of the beast. Sometimes area scouts are there to truly evaluate the player. Sometimes they're there to see because they might have heard about this guy and want to see it for themselves, and so there's a lot of different reasons. Hopefully, mostly we're there to evaluate the player because we have general actual interest in the player, and obviously we're led by the player, right? Like whatever the player does or doesn't do, we hope the player obviously hits us in the face, and we want to report up. We want to keep driving looks to this player. But that's not the case for whatever reason. Like there's so many players every year that we might scout on a smaller scale. That doesn't mean we don't have interest in that player. We just have less interest than maybe taking them high. But that is, and it's hard, right? Like those conversations are hard. I think honesty always is the best policy. Like if there were families that I had developed relationships with as an area scout, you hope that you can get to a point of like, hey, this is where we're evaluating him. I understand your expectations. There's 29 other teams. If this is your expectation, maybe one of these teams will do that. And maybe when it gets down to that point, when it's late in the process, you can have those conversations with those players. And I hope that you can do that. I don't think we necessarily always do those conversations and really follow up in it. And it can be, I can see how that can be a letdown going to school. I also want to remind kids like going to school is not a downfall. Like that, man, like so many people don't get to do that, and so it's like, it's more, I want kids to look at it as like, you know what? I hope that they use it as like motivation. It's like, okay, maybe they relied on me. It's like, that's what drove, like, I always wanted to sign out of high school. Personally, I never wanted to go to college. I thought college baseball was great. My dad was a college coach forever. I always wanted to be good enough to sign out of high school. Like all my, the people I looked up to, I wasn't good enough. I had some like guys that would show up and, I would do like mess around with scouts at my dad's scout day, at his college, and got to know guys, but I wasn't good enough. And yeah, I was a little sad about that. Let's be fair. Like I wanted to do that, but I also knew like, all right, I'll go prove them, like use it as an opportunity, not as a disappointment. And who knows, man, you go to college, you use it as a chip on your shoulder, and you might end up doing much better for yourself come 3 years or 2 years or 1 year, whether it be junior college or Division 1, because we're going to scout you wherever you go. So if we scouted you in high school, most likely if there's a report in the system, we're going to keep track of you and keep following you.
So you mentioned earlier about signability. Obviously that has a lot to do with whether a player gets drafted, where he gets drafted. But I want to talk about really the role of an advisor and an agent. Can you talk a little bit about, in your experience, like what role an agent plays for a kid through the draft?
Yeah, and with everything, right? Like you have good experiences, you have bad experiences. We've had some great experiences just communicating, and so which has led us to being here. And I think there's like we all talk, right? Like we see each other at games. We're all kind of at the same places. So I think what an agent does ultimately is represents the player and the player's needs and what they and their expectations, like what they want out of their career. And then the hope obviously is that there's equal communication and clear communication from the players' wants and needs to what the organization's needs and wants are, and how those expectations collide. And so there's got to be a respect. I always try to keep a respect for, if the player chose this person as their representation and they're telling me this is the person that's representing me, there's got to be a respect there. If I respect the player and the person that's making that decision, then in turn I have to go into this relationship with the agent, and whether it be a negotiation, whether it be just a conversation on, hey, when's this guy pitching? You have to have this mutual respect. And so I think it's like it's very much like it can be a middleman, and it can also be a decision maker. I think the agent, at the end of the day, it can be whatever the player wants the agent to be. I mean, you work for the player, and we work, and ultimately, if there weren't players, we don't have jobs, So it's like we kind of all work for the player, essentially,
Right.
And so I think having the healthy mindset of like, the agent is here to help me and to help guide me, and so I need to get someone. I try to look at the players, and it's like, I have players all the time. They're like, all right, I don't know much about agents. Who should I pick? I'm like, get someone that you really trust, someone that you would let into your family, right? Because if you're allowing them the space to speak on things that are your future and your life, please do it with like the utmost like responsibility, because it's important. This is a large amount of money we're talking about. This is like could be life-changing opportunity and money that could help you and for many years to come, whether it be baseball or just, how you live your life, how you put your kids through college. It's like it's a bigger scope. So I think an agent plays a very vital role, and it's becoming a landscape where agents are there. There's a lot of agents, and there's good ones. There's ones that are bad. Whatever, it's whoever you want to let to your life.
Yeah, I've noticed, oftentimes, and I'm primarily speaking, I think for high school players, they all value certain things differently as they meet with agents and advisors. The one thing that I think is important is obviously you want to make sure that there's a level of trust that as an agent you have with any player and family that you're representing. But I've noticed that there's also a balance of there needs to be trust, but that trust needs to be built on an actual relationship that isn't a one. We just had one meeting and now the player is signed with me, and so I represent this player. Because what I've seen is that agent can really go to great lengths to make decisions for the player that greatly impact what's going to happen to him in the next 6 months, 12 months, 5 years.
Right.
And I think because this business that I'm in is so competitive, agents, and I oftentimes talk about this, it's like agents are motivated by different things. And you really have to slow things down as you're meeting with agents and really get to know the character and really what they're about. Because our role, and you said it earlier, we're here to work for you. My job as an agent and an advisor is I need to make you an expert on all these things that you're going to have to make decisions about. And it's my job to help give you this information. And I am here to offer you my opinion, but it is your decision. And I want you to feel empowered to make that decision. Not, all right, Matt, what do you think I should do? You decide. I don't want to deal with it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Now you're making decisions in the future. You're regretting them for whatever reason. So it's
the intention behind the action, right? Like, it would be huge for me. It's like, is this person really valuing me as a human and what's best for me and my future? Or am I just another player he's representing, in this long docket of things that maybe they're trying to accrue. And so I think it's probably just the intentionality of it.
Yeah, I agree. I really only have, I guess, one other question for you, buddy, which is as a player goes from the draft, let's assume he signs, he gets into pro ball. I know you obviously had a relationship with your scout after you signed. Can players expect to have this ongoing relationship with their scout, or are they kind of passed off to the organization? Because keep in mind, for any family who's listening to this, who really just doesn't know the answer to this or has never experienced this or never even heard about it, these scouts, like Alex has been in and he's seen these guys for so many now months and essentially almost a year, if not longer. And now you're on to the next draft class. And so while you may stay in touch, those players are kind of passed off to the player development department who, correct me if I'm wrong, they've seen the kid a handful of times, but it's not like they've seen him as much as you have.
Right. Yeah. It's a complicated thing because you get to know them so well, and then all of a sudden they're like, here you go. Right. And so I think to answer your question, like I always tried to stay in touch. Like once we as an organization pass the baton to this next stage of this player's life and development, it's kind of taken off my plate. But I always tried to make it a point of like keeping the relationship together, right? Like, hey man, if I can continue to like support you in any way, whether it's a birthday text, whether it's like a handwritten note at Christmas, say, hey man, hope you're doing well, hope your off season's going well. Please let me know if you need anything. I try not to interfere with other departments, right? Like there's things that PD may be working on with the player that I'm not going to try to interfere with, because my job is to be paid is to identify players and get the best player available so we can develop them into major leaguers. With that being said, I try to keep touch with players and oftentimes keep touch with players that I don't even, that we don't even end up signing. And that's been the case. You show up at a game and you see a kid that you scouted since he was 16 and you're able to have a conversation. That's really special to me. That's something that I value because you spend a lot of time with these players and with these teams. And so that's not every case. Like, and I don't think it's wrong if a scout, were to sign a player and pass him off. Shoot, that's probably, it's probably less headache at times, the emotional side. Sometimes I kick myself because I'm riding the wave of this player and, his emotions are where he's at is in his personal life. And, I'm there to help him. And, with that being said, that's just kind of how I'm wired though, so learning to embrace that, like, I love the people part, man. And like, I'm there to a degree, you're kind of always tied to that player as the signing scout. And so I always try to take passion, not in an overbearing way, not in a like bug that player way, but just like, hey man, I saw you had a baby. I'm so happy for you, whether it's sending them a gift or whether it's like, hey man, congrats on the wedding or whatever it is. Hey, congrats on making the major leagues, man. I always envisioned this for you. I'm so happy you did all that you did, right? Like I was just a small part in that to get you to your career of your dream, and ultimately I hope that that's the relationship that carries with those players, and you're able to build those relationships. It's more than just baseball for me. So,
and I think that is the perfect way to end this, buddy.
I appreciate you, man.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough. This is great.
Yeah.
And as I shared with you, I know we kind of talked about doing this. Really, I just want to pour into these parents and these young kids who are going through this, who may not have, the advice or people looking out for them. And I know that you're somebody who cares about the person, as you've said multiple times on this podcast. So thank you. It means so much to me. And I'll see you out on the trail, buddy.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you. Love the concept here, man. And it's vitally important. So anything I can do to like uplift the game of baseball and the roots of what I think are important, I think it's and a lot of people think are important. I think that's what can help drive our game forward. So appreciate the invite, man. Thanks.
Awesome, man. Thank you, brother.